My name is James William Henry Justice. My friends call me Jim or Jimmy. I'm originally from London, England. I was born on 1925 on 2nd of June on my mother's birthday. My dad was in World War One. He joined up in 1916. At the end of the war, when he was demobilized, jobs were very scarce because there were a lot of people coming out of services. And so he couldn't get a decent job. So what he did was he signed up for the Graves Commission in France. Now, the Graves Commission was during the war when the soldiers were killed, they dug big holes in the ground and buried all the bodies in the ground and covered them up for sanitary purposes. And Dad's job was to dig up the bodies, identify them, their tags and names and addresses, go through letters, etc., make sure there were no bad letters in that would be sent to their wives that would cause any problems. And they were all collected and returned to the families in England. Most of the bodies were buried there, and right in the same place where they found them. He said you dig them up and the bodies would look almost like they were alive. He said, but when you lifted them up, he said, the flesh would fall off the bodies. He said, so it was pretty disturbing sort of job to have. And of course, after the war, when he came home from there, he got himself a job as a journeyman butcher, and later on got a full-time job at a big dairy company as a butcher. But he also went into the grocery business, and we had a small grocery store which my mother ran during the day and Dad looked after during the night and weekends. When I was born, I was only 4 pounds in weight, so I was a bit of a weedy kid, you know. And I got to the age of 7, and there was a kid that lived opposite, an Irish kid that lived opposite, and he was sort of a bit of a bully. And one day, after school, he picked on me, and we got in a fight in the middle of the street. Well, my uncle and my dad happened to be looking out the window at the time, and they saw me fighting him, and I was doing a good job. And the family had always been into boxing. My uncle, Marine boxer, and my other uncle, a contender for the lightweight championship. And so they said, let's get him boxing, you know, build him up and everything else, you know. So they sent me to a boxing club in London, which was run by a previous heavyweight championship champion of the British Empire. And I went to that club, and I used to go every evening after school and Sunday afternoons and spend a couple of hours there getting taught boxing, etc. I was the youngest one there. I was only 7, and they would put me in the room with kids that were 12 and 13-year-olds. So I used to get the devil beaten out of me, you know. I soon learned to defend myself, though. But my grandfather was what they call a street fighter. All the pubs used to have their tough guy, you know, and they would get together and contest each other, and they'd bet on the fights, you know. And the fights would take place outside the pub on the streets. And my grandfather, who wasn't very big, he was only about 5'3" or 4", but he was built like a brick. You know, really, really well built. And he would fight anyone. And he apparently got into a fight one day with a big black guy who was about 6'6", and he was only about 5'3", and they fought for an hour and a half apparently until they decided in the end they'd give up. They called it a draw. But and so they were always into that. So when they saw me in the street fighting like that, they said, let's give him some boxing training. And by the age of I guess I must have been about 10, someone arranged a tournament, and there was a gentleman's club, and they, like lords and ladies, etc., but the gentleman's club used to have a boxing tournament every year, annually. And I was somehow or other got into that tournament, and I went to a place called Thames House Number 1, which was in London, where all these gentlemen were. And I was to fight a guy, and I think his name was Smallwood. And so I was sitting in the dressing room there. My dad was at work. My mother was looking after the shop. I was all by myself, you know. I had to travel down to London by myself to Thames House, number 1. So I'm sitting in the dressing room getting ready, and in comes this Lord someone or other, you know, big man. You could tell he was a wealthy, well-bred man, you know. And he started chatting to me, asking me about school and one thing and the other, you know. And he said, "Well, what did you have for dinner?" I said, "Well, I had a kipper." A kipper is like a dried fish that you fry up, you know. And it kind of amused him. Well, after the fight, which I won incidentally, they had a dinner, and we boxers were all invited to the dinner. You know, I didn't know which spoon was which. You know, they all did. And he said he made a speech, this gentleman, and in his speech he said one of our contestants of the night actually fought on a kipper. Which amused everyone, you know. I guess I shrunk in the chair a little bit, but that was the story of that. I did later on fight at Thames House number 2, but that was a different story. I was 14, yes. People were lulled in the belief that there wasn't going to be another war. But Winston Churchill had been saying, "Get prepared. The Germans are getting prepared for war." Then later on, I think it was 1939, the British now realized that something was going to happen. And they started issuing gas masks to all the population. And I remember going with my mother and my brother my mother and my father to a local place where we were fitted with gas masks. And these gas masks were, you put them on, and they gave you a little cardboard box, which was about 6 by 6 by 4 or something. And you carried your gas mask, and everywhere you went, you had to have this gas mask on your shoulder. So you carried that around all the time. Then in July the 2nd was a Saturday, and I was evacuated from London to Cambridge. Now your parents took you to the station where you met up with the people from your own school or something like that, you know, and you all went together on a train. The parents didn't know where you were going, when they were going to see you again, or anything. So it was kind of heartbreaking as far as the parents were concerned. Imagine being separated from your child and not knowing where the devil they're going. There's a war on, a bombing, and God knows coming. So anyway, we arrived in Cambridge, and we were then led through the streets in a stream of about 50 or 60 people, kids, you know. And we were taken round the houses from door to door, and people were asked to take in children to look after them semi-permanently. And they were given a very small sum of money for your food and everything. So people naturally wanted to pick out the kids they wanted, right? The healthy-looking kid, they didn't want this skinny little kid here or that big tall one there or this big heavy one, you know. So you were picked out like cattle pretty much. And I was very fortunate that the lady that I went to, whose name was Mrs. Phillips, in Cambridge, she picked me out. I guess I had a smile on my face, so she thought it was a happy, healthy-looking kid, you know. And she picked me out, but they said, you know, "We need you to take 2. Would you take another one?" So she accepted another child. So we lived with her, and I lived with her for about a year. And those people were so wonderful. I kept in touch with them right until about 1970. And I still write to her daughter after all these years. I thank them. It's the end of 1940. I decided I didn't want to stay in Cambridge anymore. I wanted to go back to London. So my dad came and picked me up, and we left for London on a bus, on a coach, and we left about 8 o'clock in the evening. But we didn't get home till 1:30 in the morning because we had to stop several times en route because of the bombing. And then we got into North London, and there'd been a bomb on the road near there, and we were stuck there with in the coach. And of course the ack was going and the bombs were dropping, fortunately not too close to us. And we finally got home about 1:30 in the morning. My mother was going crazy. She wondered what had happened to us, because she didn't know I was coming home anyway, but she wondered what happened to my dad. Anyway, because of the bombing, and my dad being what was a prominent citizen, he had a shop, a little shop in the area, they did fire watching, what they call fire watching. All the people in the street were given a night and a roster, and they would stay up all night in a house nearby, and when the incendiary bombs or anything like that came down, they had a bucket with sand in it and a squirter with water in it, and they would go out and throw the sand over the incendiary bombs to put them out. And of course they had to go into houses, etc., on the roof, etc. And I was at the age where I was able to do the going out and the fire watching as well. So I did that once a week with my dad. And one particular night, we were sitting in the kitchen at the shop, and it was about 11 o'clock at night, and the incendiary bombs started coming down. So we went out to get on do our job, with the sandbags, etc. And my dad opened the street door, and he was just about to step out, and I don't know what made me do it, but I grabbed him by the arm, and I think what happened, I heard this bomb swishing coming down, and it landed there in front of him. If he'd have taken another step, it would have hit him. And anyway, the bombing usually started at sunset or twilight, around 6 o'clock, and it went on all night. And sometimes there'd be a lull in the rage, while they went back and came back again, And of course they would get huge fires going, with the incendiary bombs, fortunately a little further down towards the city than where we were living. And they would bomb these fires, and then they'd cause a firestorm. The more they bombed, the more it heated up, so you would get this big conflagration, and the thing would spread all over the place. And they would keep bombing them like that. And where we lived was on top of a hill, and it went down a hill down to King's Cross Station. And halfway down the hill was a school called Rising Hill Street School. And unfortunately, it was used for people who had been bombed out and had nowhere to live. So they turned the school into living quarters, And it was very rough living, but they had a roof over their heads. And the Germans came over one night and they dropped an aerial landmine, which was similar to the mines they put in the sea, but they dropped them by parachute. And the thing about these was they came down and they exploded above ground, which gave a vastly wider blast area, did a lot of damage. Unfortunately, one of those things landed on the school and flattened the school. So there were hundreds of people sort of all killed that night. And in the shop, we had all the stuff on the shelves all came all over the floor, so we had to clean that all up, So, but people adapted to it. It's amazing, you're all in the same boat, and there was spirit. There was a spirit about the people. Cockney humour kept everyone going. So
that's the best way. Were there blackouts?
Now, I think we moved 7 or 8 times between the time I was 3 and the time I was about 13, 14. And I don't know whether they couldn't pay the rent or what it was, but we were constantly moving. As a result of that, I went to so many different schools. I could learn things like English and composition and that sort of thing. But every school I went to, the maths was different. I was completely confused with math, and right until the age of about 13, I never could follow mathematics very well. But come the age of 13, there was you were able to enter these things at school and write compositions and answer questions like a sort of a test, And these went to the various colleges, and mine happened to go to Northern Polytechnic in London, North London. And to my surprise, I got an interview, which was attended by myself and my father. And my father was a very friendly, outgoing guy, and he got on very well with the guy. And the guy that interviewed me happened to be the principal of the college. And he said to me, how do you think you did in the exams? I said, well, I think I did pretty well in the English and geography perhaps and things like that. I said, but I know I didn't do very well in the math. And he said, well, that's a good thing. You didn't do very well in the math. He said, but you did well in the other things. He said, and I appreciate the fact that you understand that you're not good at math, he said. Anyway, as a result of that, I was awarded a 2-year Junior County of London scholarship to go to college with all the fees paid and a small living allowance, books, etc. free. So my parents let me go to the college for 2 years. And then 2 years later, I took another test, and they reviewed all the work I'd done during the first 2 years, and I managed to get the Senior County of London Technical Scholarship, which gave me another 3 years of everything paid for. So, and I completed about 2 years of that, but the war had started, and the classes were very intermittent because of the bombing and one thing and the other, so it was very interrupted. In the meantime, I joined the Air Training Corps, which was like the American ROTC, but it was particularly for Air Force, people wanting to go in the Air Force. And I was very fortunate in going to the college that I got a very good teacher, and he taught me math. And by the end of the first year, I loved math. I hated it before. I mean, the other teachers, if you didn't know the answer, you got the cane. I mean, this guy explained it to you, so you knew what it was all about. So I did very well there, and of course that carried me over. But at the end of the 2 years, I was senior cadet at the college, Air Training Corps, and I volunteered for the Air Force. And I went for my interview, and I passed all the medicals, etc. I was too short in the legs to be a pilot. I couldn't reach right down to steer the aircraft with my feet. I said, well, can I become an air gunner? And of course, in those days, air gunners' lives were pretty short because air gunners sat at the front of the aircraft, on top of the aircraft, at the back of the aircraft. And you had to be small, which I suited at that time, because I was only 5'3". But the life of those air gunners was very short because the German fighters would come up the back, and of course they'd fire into that rear turret there, and they had to be hosed out, some of those guys, by the time they'd finished. They'd get the aerodrome, they'd hose them out, they'd be bits. And so the guy said to me, we don't need air gunners, we need navigators. You've done very well as a navigator, we need navigators. Your tests, math tests and everything were great, so you're going to be a navigator. So that's how I became a navigator. And I went to a recruiting centre, and while I was at the recruiting centre, I filled out all the things, interests, and one of the things was sports, and I put down boxing. So they said to me, would you box on our boxing team? We're giving an exhibit at the end of the month, So I said, sure. So I had 3 fights in one afternoon, and they selected me for the team. And I boxed in the team, and I fought a guy who was the Silver Wings champion and beat him in 3 rounds on points. As a result of that, they wanted me to stay on the boxing team and become a sergeant physical ed guy, Well, I didn't want that. I wanted to be flying. That was my main thing. So as a gift to me for being on the boxing team, they said, "Where do you want to be stationed?" I'd been evacuated to Cambridge previously, so I said I'd like to go to Cambridge, which was only 60 miles from London, direct line, and so they posted me to Cambridge, and I was stationed in St John's College, where I took my training as a navigator. Eventually transferred up to Manchester, ready to go overseas to Canada. And we'd only been crossing the Irish Sea for a couple of hours, and we were spotted by a German Focke-Wulf aircraft, reconnaissance aircraft. And they spotted us, and from that point onwards, within a matter of hours, we were spotted by a submarine, and we were followed by a submarine. And we were followed by this submarine 3 days and 3 nights. And we ran into a storm, and every time the ship ran into a huge wave, the back would come up, the propellers would go out to the water, and the whole ship would vibrate. And so that went on for 3 days. And we were on guard duty, and I was feeling not too well. But fortunately, when we got there, I was at the back of the queue for the things, and we had 4 tiered bunks. And we slept like 4 people on top of one another. I thought at the beginning I was unfortunately on the top bunk, which I was. But I found out afterwards it couldn't have been a better thing, because once all these storms started, people were puking and being sick over the sides. I was on top, these guys down below. They were the ones getting the rough stuff. So it worked out pretty well, actually. But we were given American... what did they call them? The American packs, food packs. I think I've forgotten the K-rations. K-rations they were called, that's right. And we thought they were great because they had cookies inside, they had crackers with cheese, a couple of cigarettes, chocolate bar, and the things like. We thought that was pretty good, So that was what we sort of lived on for a few days there, because I didn't smoke, so I changed my cigarettes for candy, which was good. So then we went across the Atlantic to Halifax. Coming back from Canada, things had got better, and German submarine menace was not quite as bad by that time. That was in December 1944. And we were escorted by a couple of warships who for some reason fired off their guns about 11 o'clock every morning. I was thinking to myself, boy, you're identifying where we are. These submarines know where we are. But we never had any problems coming back. But the beauty of coming back was we had hammocks instead of bunks. And it was so nice. Once you got used to being bent up, curled up like that, all night, they were nice because they moved with the boat, so you didn't get so seasick. Flying different troops and passengers and VIPs, we went to roughly 50 different countries, all over from Italy to France to right out to India and places like that, and even into Iraq and southern Saudi Arabia. So we travelled around quite a bit in that time. They sent me to Cairo because our squadron had been moved from Italy to Egypt and arrived in Cairo. And it was a base where you were distributed from, they would send you to various place assignments, And I'd been there a couple of days, and 2 buddies of mine arrived from my squadron. They were a few years older than me, so demobilisation depended upon your age, years of service and things like that. So they were going out ahead of me, So they arrived at the base there, and their names were Paul White and George White. And they weren't related at all, just happened to have the same surname. And so we spent some time with them, and George and I went into Cairo that afternoon, and we bought some leather handbags because they were very inexpensive there, to send home to our wives and that. And George bought a leather handbag for his girlfriend, And we went back to base, and we went in the mess there, and we played table tennis. And I was a rather competitive type of player, and George was a good player, but I would not let George win, which I regretted. Anyway, that evening we were back at our tent and we decided to go over for a meal. So we walked over, it was a couple of 100 yards, I think, from our tent to the mess hall. And we were walking along, and I was on the left, George was in the middle, and Paul was on the right. And we were just chatting, you know. And suddenly I heard a guard shout out something, halt, or something like that. And apparently the other two didn't hear it, but I did. I said, someone shouted out, halt, you know. And we stood there for a few minutes and listened, didn't hear any more. So we started walking on. And suddenly, bang. And I said, someone's firing, throw yourself down. And I threw myself on the floor. As I did so, I saw George fall backwards out the corner of my eye. So I laid on the floor there for a few seconds, and I looked over, and George was over there. I crawled on the ground over to George, and he was laying there, and it was a moonlit night, and I could see the blood accumulating around here. And one of the guards, a young guy who just come from England, who was a rookie, you know, had fired into camp, and you never fire into camp, you always fire out of camp. And he'd got nervous, and he'd fired. So George was laying there with this bleeding, so I said to Paul, I'll stay with George, go over and get an ambulance. So Paul sort of crouched, run across the thing there, and he got to the mess, and about 10 minutes later an ambulance arrived, and they put George in the ambulance, and I went in the ambulance with him. And he was in pain, obviously. So I was holding his hand, and I said, you all right, George? And he said, my feet are going cold. I said, oh, you'll be all right, George. And he said, send my handbag, that handbag I bought for my girlfriend, make sure it's sent off to her. I said, I will. So we drove to the hospital in Cairo, and they took him in the operation room. A short time later, they came out and told us he'd passed away. Well, after leaving Cairo, I was posted to Iraq, a station called Shaiba, which was in southern Iraq near the Persian Gulf. And I was there. I was a navigation briefing officer, and my job was to brief people going towards Cairo and towards India, you know, whichever way they were going, and give them a briefing on the routes and heights to fly and things like that, you know. The conditions in Iraq were terrible. I lived in a little hut under the little room under the ground. It was buried about 6 feet under the ground. And if I stood on my bunk, I could see out the window, which was ground level. And of course, it was done for the purpose of keeping it cool. But it was at like 120 in the shade and 99% humidity. But fortunately, the way it worked, I would do like a day and a half on and then get 3 days off. You know, so I was actually, I go there, no aircraft much would arrive at night, so obviously you had to sleep at night, so it worked out a pretty good shift to be on. And I was there for about 9 months. People were going down with heat stroke and that sort of thing. A buddy of mine actually went crazy and they had to ship him back to Cairo because he just went off his head, you know, with the heat. But we had a beautiful swimming pool there. So we used to go swimming every day, you know, in the pool. There were only 2 women on the camp. The rest were all men. And they ran the catering services. So, and of course they were in great demand. But anyway, I was there for quite a while, and we had to put up with scorpions, you know, getting in your shoes. So every morning you would take your shoe, turn it upside down and bang it, make sure there wasn't a scorpion in there. There were camel spiders running all over the wall, which were about that size, you know, and they would fall on you. So we used to have a mesh net over the bed so that they fell on the mesh net, you know. So, but anyway, it wasn't a bad posting really, and got very friendly with a lot of guys there, and eventually was sent back for demobilization. We'd been briefed to go on a trip to the continent. We didn't know where we were going because they tell you that when you get the briefing. So in the afternoon, we went into town and had a few drinks with the boys. I didn't drink at all. I didn't drink alcohol. So went into town with the boys and had a bit of fun. And they picked up a couple of girls and had a hell of a time, you know, in the country, sitting in the grass there. And so we went to the briefing, and we arrived at the briefing. And when we got there, the CO, commanding officer, came on the stage and said, "Guys, the war's over." This was May the 8th. It's my brother-in-law's birthday, as a matter of fact. May the 8th. The war's over. You've all got a 48-hour pass. So, of course, everyone took off and got in their bicycles. Everyone had a bicycle. You know. Bicycled into town, got to the railway station. The railway station was packed with people, the whole thing. And we were waiting for the train to London. I don't know if we had tickets or what we had, but there we were on the train station there. And the train eventually came in, and in England at that time, they had first, second and third class carriages. Well, the upper crust went in the first class carriages because they were more expensive. And then the second class and the third class, which was ordinary people in the third class. As it happened, the first class stopped right in front of where we were sitting. So we were rushed in and got on the train, packed in there, you know, standing up, sitting on the seats. We got in the train and we went in the first class carriage. And sitting in the corner of the first class carriage was this old Dowager Duchess lady, you know, all dressed up and obviously untouched by the war, you know, or anything like that. And she started bitching at us. "You're not allowed in here. This is first class." And she was going on and on and on, you know. And this went on for 10 minutes or so, and the train took off for London, you know. And there was a guy there, a friend of mine, his name was Frank Fellows. He was either a navigator or a wireless operator, I can't remember now. Anyway, Frank had had enough. He'd had a few drinks too, you know. And after she'd been bitching like this for a while, he grabbed hold of this lady, and by the collar, he didn't hurt her or anything, he was very gentle, got hold of her by the collar, and he put his face right up against her. He said, "If you don't shut your effing trap," he said, "I'm going to show you out this effing window." And the lady never said another word till we got to London. Anyway, having arrived in London, I left King's Cross Station. I went up the hill there, past Rising Hill Street, where the bombing had taken place there, and got home, and Pauline was there at my father's shop, and Mum and Dad and everyone. And we had a hell of a time. Everyone was dancing and singing, and, you know, they couldn't believe the war was over, because it was only over in Europe. It wasn't over in Japan, you know. But everyone was singing and having a wonderful time, and partying in the streets, drinking, you know. And some of the young lads went into the houses nearby, especially the ones that had been bombed, ripped up the floorboards and everything wood there, and built a huge bonfire in the middle of the street, you know, with this big bonfire going. And the night went on, you know, celebrating. It was just wonderful. It was a day to remember. Oh, I was in the Air Training Corps, and Pauline was in the Women's Junior Air Corps, which was another organisation for training to be in the Women's Air Force. And a buddy of mine at the Air Training Corps had met this girl, and he was kind of keen on her, you know. So he said to me, "Jimmy, would you go to the school dance in North London," which was 2 or 3 miles away from where we lived. He said, "Because I've seen this girl up there," he said, "and I sort of like her and I want to get a date with her." And I said, "Well, I'm not really interested in dancing and that, Tony." I said, "No." Anyway, Tony persuaded me, so I went with Tony. and we arrived at the dance. And his girlfriend happened to be a friend of Pauline, my wife, later wife. And I saw Pauline dancing with this guy, and he obviously wasn't really interested in her, but he liked to dance with her. And he was dancing away like this, and she's looking up into him with love in her eyes. And she's got this beautiful figure, wonderful legs, shortish skirt down to the knees, and long flowing black hair. And I thought, oh my God, that's the girl for me. And I instant love. So the following week, Tony said he's going to dance again, so we went back. And that's when I met Pauline and asked her to dance, and we got on very well, and we danced all evening and enjoyed ourselves, and the parade was going on still outside, and I said, can I take you home? And she said, sure. So I took her home, and we got to near her house, and we arrived at the house, and there about a couple of 1,000 feet up above, they'd got a German aircraft. It was a Heinkel, I think, bomber, and they'd got it triangulated in the searchlights. And they were blasting away with the AK guns and one thing the other. And there's this gentleman standing on the corner. And so I was chatting to him, and we were saying, boy, he's going to get it. He's had it, And we were watching this there, and suddenly I looked round and no Pauline. Where's she gone? Well, as it turned out, the gentleman on the corner was her father. He had just arrived home from work. She was late for curfew, so while I was talking to him, she sneaked around the corner and got indoors. So I didn't get to say goodnight to her or anything like that, But I found out where she lived, and got to meet her at the dance again, and we made a date to go to the cinema on this Saturday. Well, she didn't turn up. So I went to her house and I knocked at the door. And I must have thought I was something special, because I'd had business cards, visiting cards printed with my name, J. Justice Jr., and my telephone number on it and everything. So I knocked at the street door, and her sister, Pat, answered the door. And round the corner was this boy, and I recognised him. He had been at Cambridge, same school that I was at. And he looked round the door, and I said to Pat, is Pauline in? And she said, I didn't know it was Pat, I just said, is Pauline in? She said, no, she's not here. I said, well, I had a date with her and she didn't turn up. I said, so I'm going to leave you my card. Calling card, 15-year-old kid with a calling card. So I gave her the calling card with my telephone number on. Anyway, apparently, her brother, who'd seen me round the corner, I'd met him at Cambridge, incidentally. He said to her, now, you give this boy a call, he said, because he's a nice boy, he said, and I like him. And he said, if you don't give him a call by the end of the week, she said, I'm going to give you a right thrashing, he said. Anyway, weekend was over, she hadn't called. Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, she hadn't called. He said, if you don't call this boy, he said, I'm going to give you a real good hiding. And he did use it, our brothers did. So anyway, she gave me a call, and we made an arrangement to take her to the cinema. Well, I was at school. I wasn't that well off financially. My parents used to give me a small allowance weekly, or a few sixpence or a shilling or something like that. So I'd arranged to go to the cinema. So I managed to get an extra couple of shillings out of my parents, Well, when I turned up at the cinema, she'd brought a girlfriend along. Not only she brought a girlfriend along, but she brought this girl along that I dated once. So anyway, I just about had enough money to pay for the cinema ticket. And we left her to run all the way home from where the cinema was, 3 miles to get home. I couldn't afford the bus fare. Anyway, after that, we started dating pretty regularly, and we saw each other practically every night of the week. I would go to my ATC thing, and she'd go to a women's junior record, and afterwards I would go and meet her from where she was, And we used to walk along the street, and we used to walk about 3 miles to a place called the Angel, which was where I lived, which wasn't a very good district. I think if Pauline had known I came from the Angel, she'd never have dated me because that was a real bad area. Anyway, we used to walk a lot hand in hand. We were in love. And walk hand in hand up to this place by the Angel. And there was a guy named Jacko there, and he had a kind of a bin with a fire in it, and he used to roast potatoes. And so we used to walk all the way up there, and we'd get a hot potato each, which was wrapped in a newspaper, and we put salt and some sort of grease on it. I'm sure it wasn't. God knows what the grease was, because butter and margarine was rationed, but it tasted good. And we would walk all the way back. And then we usually had enough money to go from there up to where she lived, which was another 3 miles on. And then I'd see her home, and I'd leave her about 11 o'clock, and then if I caught the last tram or bus, that was fine, but otherwise I would run all the way back home. So anyway, after that, we just went everywhere together. Before I went off to Canada, Pauline and I got engaged. We wanted to get married. Our parents said we were too young. There was a very popular song at the time called, they tried to tell us we're too young to really be in love. Well, anyway, we were in love. And but they allowed us to get engaged after a big argument. So anyway, I went back to Manchester, where I was stationed at the time, and Pauline and I were thinking of running off to Scotland, because there was a place in Scotland where you could get married without a license, and without any questions. But eventually we decided against that. So they said, when you come back from Canada, if you still feel the same, then you can get married. So anyway, I came back from Canada in December 1944, and Pauline had arranged the wedding for the 17th of December. I arrived home about 2 or 3 days before that. I wasn't due to come home, but when I was in Canada, the last ship to get me home before that date was full, and I wasn't on the list. So I wasn't exactly a religious kind of character, but I went and saw the local minister, and I explained to him my future wife had arranged for the wedding on December 17th, and I'd like to get on the boat if at all possible. Well, next morning I was on the list, so I was on the boat home, and I got home and arrived in London. Pauline came up to meet me when I arrived in Lancashire it was, and we went back to London, and that was 2 days before the wedding. And then we had the wedding, which went off very well, apart from a big hour and a quarter late for the ceremony, but due to the horse and carriage problem. So we had a party at the house, and there were probably about 60 people there, And the usual thing with the parties, we always had parties at the house. It was a regular thing. And everyone would sing and dance and carry on, until about 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning. And then, because the raids were on and everything, people would lay on the floor, and we'd all go to sleep on the floor, we find a place and sleep, And we had a few bridesmaids, and one of the bridesmaids, the kids, was to be the ring bearer, they dressed him in an RAF uniform. They'd made an RAF uniform for this kid, And his parents were there, and they stayed the night. And the bombing went off, of course. And Pauline and I finally went to bed. I think it was about 5 or 6 o'clock in the morning by that time. And in the morning, the people left, and the young kid and his parents arrived home to find their house completely bombed out. So if they hadn't been at that party, they'd have been dead. So after the wedding, I think we spent a day in London, and then Pauline and I decided we'd go on a short honeymoon to Cambridge, which we both knew. We stayed at the Dolphin Hotel in Cambridge, and we arrived and checked. I'd booked a room. We checked in, and the guy, you had to have your ration book, you had to present to the people, and your identity card. So I pulled out the ration books and the identity card. Pauline's ration book was the child's ration book. And the guy looked at me and he said, "This is a child's ration book." So I said to Pauline, "Quick," she got her marriage certificate out and showed it to him. I said, "Okay." So anyway, but the night of our wedding, we stayed in London and the V2s were falling. And of course, if you heard a V2 explode, that meant you were safe because they were supersonic. You could hear a bomb coming down, whistling or shrishing, but you couldn't hear the V2s because they went up so high and they came down above the speed of sound. So you didn't hear the sound of them coming down. All you heard was the explosion. So if you heard the explosion, you knew you were safe. Whereas the buzz bombs at the beginning of the war used to come across, they were fueled with an amount of fuel and they would drive over London and then the fuel would run out and then they would crash. So if you heard a buzz bomb going and you heard the engine going, you're all right. As soon as you heard that engine stop, you could have dived into a corner somewhere. But the V2s, as I say, we didn't even notice. Anyway, we went off to Cambridge and we stayed there for 3 or 4 days and visited the people that I'd been evacuated with, and had a nice time. And we went back to London, and for a while I was on leave, and then of course I had to go back to base. But when I got back to base, the war was still on, and when the war finished on May the 8th, we went on leave, of course, for a few days. And when I got back, I found that I'd been transferred to Transport Command. And we were being trained to go to Japan to drop these troops on Japan for the invasion. But the danger was that when we got there, we had to land at places of opportunity, which meant you didn't have enough gas to get back from where you were going to drop the troops on Japan to get back to a good landing place. So you had to take places of opportunity to land. So we had to learn to land in short spaces as well. So we did that too. And we finished the training on there, and I was given 3 weeks embarkation leave to go back to and be going off to Japan, the Far East. Well, while I was on leave, they dropped the atom bomb. And when I got back, I didn't tell Pauline all this time that I was on embarkation leave to go to Japan. I thought, why spoil her holiday, you know? So when it happened, I told her, I said, we probably won't go now. So when we got back, it was all cancelled. So I reckon that atom bomb probably saved my life. Pauline had been wanting me to go back to college, and she'd been bugging the college that I went to before I left England. She made sure she visited there regularly, about once a month, to make sure I was going to get in when I got back. Well, my scholarship had expired, of course, during the war. So I went on what you would call the GI Bill, sort of thing. And I got funded for 3 years. And that's when Pauline and I had moved into that little house already, And I think it was about a year later. I went there back to college in 47. A year later, Autumn was born. And we were living, she was working up to that point, so we were managing. But once she stopped work, of course, we were really having a tough time, My parents helped out a bit, they would give us groceries from the store and things like that. But I got an increase in the grant, so that helped us, and I managed to finish the course there. Well, I did the 4-year course in 3 years. I went to day school from 9 till 4, and I went from evening classes from 6 till 9 every day of the week. I did very well because we were broke, and at the end of each term, the person that came, there were only 12 people in each group of classes, so you got really good attention, And each year there would be an exam at the end of the year on all the subjects you took. and you would be graded and you'd be put first, second, third, fourth, wherever you came in the class. Well, I think we took about 6, 7 subjects, and I usually used to manage to get first in about 5 of them, and second and third in the other 2, you know. So at the end of the term, they would award you what they called the Golden Guineas, and you would get this lump sum of money for being top. So that was very important bit of income. So I managed to get that several times, you know. And then one of the lecturers there, he liked me, and I always did very well in his classes. And when they came to the end of the college course, he said to me, "Jimmy," he said, "what are you going to do for a job?" I said, "Well, I don't know yet." I said, "I'm going to have to write around and go visit a few things." He said, "Well, I know some people at this company, which was within 15 minutes walk of where I lived, AC Cossa. They were involved in radar during the war. And in fact, Fleming Williams, the vice president of research there, was one of Watson Watt's right-hand men. Watson Watt was the guy in charge of radar during the war. And I was fortunate enough, I got an interview with Fleming Williams. And he was very nice, and he asked me lots of questions, and I answered every one, I think, except one, and I didn't know the answer to that. And he said, "Well, Jimmy, you've done very well." He said, "I'm going to send you down to the electronics department," he said, "for an interview by the head of that department, and we'll go from there." Well, I went down and had the interview, and I passed that, and so I started work the following Monday, I think it was. So that was great. So I worked there for about 4 years, started as a junior engineer, worked my way up to a senior engineer, and I did some things for them that got them out of a hole in many ways. And when I was heard about Fleming Williams left that company, and he started Colour Television Research Company. Well, when I saw that advert in the paper for engineers for Colour Television Research Company, I thought to myself, well, I'm going there. I'm going to see Fleming Williams. So I arranged for an interview. So I went for an interview, and he interviewed me, and I was earning £800 a year there, which was a good salary. I mean, an ordinary average working man was earning about 400. So 800 was good, you know. And so he interviewed me, and he was very satisfied with me, and he said, "Well, how much are you asking Jimmy a raise?" I said, "Well, £1,000 a year, you know," which was a fairly big increase. He said, "Well, that makes it worthwhile you leaving, doesn't it?" So I said, "Yes." So he said, "Well," he said, "there's one snag." He said, "When I left Cossa's," he said, "I agreed not to steal any of their personnel." He said, "So before I can say you've got the job, I have to get it cleared with personnel in Cossa's." Well, it turned out to be very fortunate. He phoned Cossa's personnel, got some guy who didn't even know who the hell I was, who said, "Oh, that's all right, Mr. Williams." So having agreed, I was in. So by the time I got back to Cossa's, I walked into my boss's office to say, "I'm sorry I'm late because I've taken the morning off." And the secretary said to me, "Oh, congratulations, Mr. Justice, I hear you're leaving us." So that was that. So then I went there, and I was put in charge of a laboratory there, investigating new colour television systems, and I developed a colour television system that was new, called an beam indexing system. Made that presentation at the Institute of Electrical Engineers a few years later, which Westinghouse saw and made me the offer I couldn't refuse. And I was in charge of that department, and the job came up. They offered me good money. As I say, couldn't refuse it. But Pauline said, "No, I'm not going." So I said, "Well, you know," we chatted about it for a while. And I said, it was a big opportunity for me and for the family, you know. I said, "So I'll ask them for 10% more salary and see what they say." Well, I asked for 10%, and of course I could have asked for 20%. I found out later on, but you know. Anyway, I got the job, and we left England, came across the Atlantic into Queen Mary, and kids love that, of course, you know. And arrived in New York, met by a Westinghouse representative, put in the Americana Hotel, which was brand new at the time, so everyone was very impressed. And we went out and had a nice steak dinner in New York, and then we went to the Empire State Building and a few places, you know, and then we flew to Pittsburgh. Now, Pauline had never flown in her life. she was scared stiff of flying. She said, if you told me this when we were crossing the Atlantic, I would never have come. So, anyway, of course, we flew down to Pittsburgh and she loved it because you're never afraid of flying after that. So that worked out very well. So we arrived in Pittsburgh and they put us in a Conley's Motel in Monroeville for 3 weeks while we were looking for a house. And we finally found a house in Murraysville, 4-bedroom house. And that was just what we were looking for. And we even found one next door for the people we came over with. So we lived side by side, 2 English families, which was good, you know, helped to break the ice a little bit. But the difficulty was that there was dock strike in New York, and all our stuff, apart from a little suitcase, all our belongings were stuck in New York in a great big 8x8 cubic chest, furniture and everything, every little detail, you know, knife, fork, spoons. So we had to go out and try and buy everything. And of course we had problems getting credit because we'd never had credit any before. But finally, from Sears, asked me where we worked for, and I told them Westinghouse Research, and they said, you know, as much credit as you like. Well, of course, then I had to keep going to my boss every week saying, I need another 1,000. I need another 1,000. He said, what the hell are you doing? I said, I'm furnishing a house with 3 kids and a wife. So anyway, it worked out all right. And the neighbours were nice. A few of them brought over some collapsible chairs and the card table. And after about 3 or 4 days, we had enough furniture to be able to go to bed. Actually, we bought a phonograph about 3 days after we got there, and it was Beatles time. You remember the Beatles at that time. So we had the Beatles records. We put them on the phonograph, and of course we were dancing in the empty rooms, you know. Having a hell of a time. I had some patents on beam indexing color TV systems that were good. Then there was a work I did on cable TV, in which we were using two-way transmission over cable TV systems for controlling things in the house, and also systems to prevent the stealing of cable signals, unauthorized use of cable signals, etc. As soon as they put it on, people were phoning the cable TV channel saying, I can't get a picture on my ordinary channel, it's all screwed up, you know. And they'd say, well, where do you live? What's your address, you know? And of course, then they were caught out stealing the channels. Now, whether they proceeded with those legally against those people or not, I suspect what they did was say, hey, you're going to pay for those channels from now on, you know. Otherwise, we'll take legal action. Westinghouse had a black and white system on the moon. And it was very successful because they were sending pictures from space and one thing the other and the moon. And I was contacted one morning, called into my boss's office, and there was a guy from Aerospace Division, Westinghouse. And I was the sort of expert on TV systems and one thing the other, so they called me in and he said, we've got black and white TV on the moon. He said, we're in space. He says, a black and white camera. He said, we want it to be a color picture from the moon. He said, not only do we want it to be a color television picture from the moon, we want the picture to be able to transmit it over ordinary television systems so that people can watch it in their home. We want it in color. You have to do it in a quarter of the bandwidth that we're currently using. We're only giving you a half a megasecond bandwidth. That's like putting a quart in a half-pint pot, you know. And I think, oh God, this is going to be difficult. So, and they went on and on about this. So I thought about this and I came up with different ways of processing the signal and putting a wheel in front of the camera and one thing the other and all that sort of thing. And I came up with, about 3 days, I came up with an idea and I wrote a very brief thing on a sheet of paper to my boss and said, yeah, this is what we can do, you know. It hasn't got all these details in, but this is the basis of what we can do, you know. So he contacted them and contacted NASA, and NASA gave us a contract to get this done in 6 months, you know. I mean, everything's got to be done in 5 minutes, you know. It took them years to develop everything for the moon, but when you got to do it, it's 5 minutes, you know. So, anyway, it went on the air later on. It was successfully transmitted, as you know, over the air. People loved it. I didn't see the first transmission for some reason. I was doing something and missed the transmission. But I found out everything went on fine. And one of the TV magazines in England said it was the greatest thing that happened during 1969, colour television from space, the first time colour had been transmitted from space. And the American, what they call themselves, Scientific Association awarded Westinghouse an Emmy for colour television in space. Of course, I never heard anything about this until I read it in the book, you know, read it in the paper. So I didn't get much credit for it. Pauline was sick for about 5 years. She went in hospital when she broke her back, and she developed pneumonia. So she was pretty much out of it for the last 5 years. And the pneumonia got to her, and that developed into lung problems, you know, and that sort of thing. And so I had time on my hands, and being a navigator during World War II, I'd studied the constellations and a little bit about astronomy and that sort of thing, you know. And I always had at the back of my mind, so I'd like to find out more about that, you know. So I went many years after I retired without doing anything much, you know. I mean, we were enjoying retirement, you know. You're busier when you retire than while you're working, you know. And we done dancing and all that sort of thing. We were partying. We had wonderful times. Anyway, got back to the cosmetology. When Pauline was sick, I had a bit of time on my hands, and I would be at the rest home, and I'd sleep on the floor all night at the side of her bed, and at the hospital I'd have a bed the side of hers, and I'd sleep all night there and all day. Anyway, when Pauline was at home, I was able to, you know, relax and more, and so I started reading a bit about astronomy, and I gradually got more interested in it. But I'd seen on TV many times these people, famous people, Bronowski and God knows who else, you know, talking about Einstein's theory of relativity and all that. I never could understand it. I think they were too educated in their subject to put it over, you know. Some people must have understood it, but I certainly didn't. So I decided I'd look into that. And I came up with after studying astronomy, with a few ideas that I'd read at various places. And I managed to prove to my satisfaction Einstein's theory of relativity, like where mass increases to infinity as you approach the speed of light. Light is the ultimate speed limit. Things like that, you know, E equals mc squared, and I managed to prove all those to my own satisfaction. It may have not been what someone scientifically would have said, oh, you know, that's poppycock, or, you know, that's not the way you should do it. That's the way I did it, and I understood it, and it satisfied me. And I'm sure it would satisfy most people, you know, the way I explain it. So I got onto that, and then I got onto more cosmology and black holes and God knows and all that stuff, and it became more and more fascinating to me. And I developed a few of my own ideas of how to present their ideas in a form that an ordinary person could understand, you know. So that's more or less where I got to. And I go to bed every night, and for an hour, I get out my books, notes that I've written on cosmology, or a few books, and I sit there and I read them through, you know, and I put them down and I go to sleep. And why I'm studying it, I don't know. What good's it going to do me? Oh, falling in love.
And
I fell in love with Pauline the first moment I saw her. From across the room. we both fell in love, and we loved each other sincerely and happily the whole life. We couldn't have had a happier marriage. 3 wonderful children. Came from very poor families, both of us. Had a wonderful life. I mean, when we were kids, you would never dream of owning a car even, you know. And here we are living in America. Wonderful house, wonderful children, good living, cars. What else do you want? 68 and a half years of marriage. Don't regret a moment of it. We held hands all our lives. We were always holding hands. I don't know whether that was a sort of, that we just wanted to be close, or it was a, you know, we just didn't want to let go of each other.
That's wonderful.
God, I was so lucky. I can't say fall in love with the right person because that's so difficult. I mean, that's a marriage made in heaven. There aren't many of those. But that's what you need. And be love and comfort each other all your lives. Never go to bed with an argument on your mind. Clear it up before you go to sleep. And always love the other person more than you love yourself. Be ready to die for them if necessary. When she married me, that was probably the happiest day of my life. She was everything that you could ever hope for. Sweet, loving, understanding, tender, caring. She loved her kids. She loved me, and I loved her. There's nothing better than being loving someone and them loving you in return. Nothing better. I just wish everyone could be as happy. I could die this minute and I would have had everything that I could ever want or ever hope for. More than I could ever hope for. Wonderful kids looking after me so well too. Mummy would have been proud of them. Well, this guy goes to the doctors and he says to the doctor, examines him, and after he's done all the tests, he said, I'm sorry to tell you, he said, you've only got 12 months to live. So the guy is sort of downhearted and off he goes, and he comes back at 12 months later. He said, Doc, you gave me 12 months to live. He said, I've only got a few weeks to go. He said, I've got bad news for you. He said, I can't pay the bill. And the doctor said, oh, that's all right. Give me another 12 months. Yeah, so we're at the hospital and this young doctor comes in. He's not very old and probably obviously not greatly experienced, but nice young man, very nice young man. And he said, Mr. Justice, I've got some bad news for you. He said, you have a very aggressive cancer of the liver. He said, we're only giving you 6 months to live, you know. And he's done this all, you know, sort of a little roundabout way, but very nicely, you know. And so I said, well, that's it, 6 months, that's it. He said, so I don't suppose I'll see you again, Mr. Justice. So I said, well, in case I don't see you again, hello. And he looked at me and he said, what is this? The Monty Python show?